Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, we're live. I'm joined today by reactionary expat, who is an Aussie expat living, I guess, in Taiwan. And do I call you Mr. Expat or just reactionary?
Either is fine.
Anyway,
Thanks for having me. Sorry.
Thank you. I've been wanting to do this because I've been long interested in Neoreaction and how it fits in the current political climate as sort of the intellectual having done some of the intellectual spade work for some of the dissident right. I'm primarily interested in populism and how populism is perhaps a revitalization movement for democratic government and so on, and an attempt to return to the roots of constitutional government. And I am interested in Neoreaction and some of the dissident right as a critique of all that. And like many things, I don't have to agree with something to see how the very questions that a philosophy asks, even if you disagree with their fundamental assumptions, can actually move the conversation forward or can actually clarify your own position or what's important. So that's why I'm really interested in Neoreaction. I find it fascinating. And I kind of want to ask you about everybody knows sort of the history, but if we go over that very quickly, the history of Neoreaction and sort of how it paved the way for the so-called alt-right and some of the populist uprisings that we've seen, what its current status is, because I guess it's in sort of a quiescent mode, or perhaps not, I'm not really sure. And then I'd like to talk about exactly what I said, how Neoreaction is a lens, it could be a lens with which we could examine some of the problems in current government and the social situation in the world today. And I know it's very late where you are, and so I don't want to take a lot of your time, so I hope we can just do this very quickly and just kind of an introduction for people who know nothing about all this stuff. I'm kind of seeing myself now as providing normie guides for some of the weirdness that's out there, because people my age have never heard of any of this stuff. And yet there's this entire culture that's moving the world forward, and it's almost as if half the planet knows nothing about it, and while the other half is in passionate debate over some of these things that anyway. So let's start with your story. What makes you, well, I know what makes you an expat. What makes you a reactionary?
So I would have described myself as a libertarian in the past. Probably for well over a decade, I was a libertarian. But towards the end of 2012, after the election that year in the US, and into early 2013, actually for some time before then, I had started to have some issues with libertarianism. It never seemed to really get anywhere, and I wondered why that was. It seemed to be a very particular thing that very particular people were interested in, but most people were not interested in it, and it never seemed to actually achieve its ends. It always seemed to be right on the cusp of breaking through if you spoke to libertarians, and yet it never did.
Yes, I voted for the Pauls most of my whenever they've run for office, and they've never gotten more than 2 or 3% of the vote.
Yeah,
Rand Paul and Ron Paul.
I first heard about libertarianism and got into it back when Harry Browne was running in the
yes.
Was that the 2000 election? I think it was. So I thought there was obviously something going on there that was making it unsuccessful, and then I just happened upon some of this stuff online, and it was a massive rabbit warren going down that hole. It just led to a whole lot of other things. Now, back then there were, so this is the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, there were a lot of blogs, neo-reactionary blogs, and a lot of people putting out a lot of theory. They had all been inspired by someone called, or who used the pen name of Mencius Moldbug. And he was a fairly prolific blogger. He's written hundreds of very, very long posts. Each one is sort of like almost a small book.
Yes.
So he was very influential upon all of these people. And initially, there were sort of three main branches of neo-reaction. So there were the kind of post-libertarian, post-neoliberal people who focused more upon economics and some aspects of governance. There were people who were more concerned about tradition, religious tradition usually, and then there were people who were more concerned about ethnic issues. But the thing that they all had in common was that they were critiquing modernity, that there's something very wrong with where we've gone. And depending on who you ask, they'll say, well, we've been going the wrong way for 60 years. Others will say we've been going the wrong way for over a century. Others will put it to the French Revolution or the Glorious Revolution in England or the Reformation even. But the thing was, they were all critiquing modernity, that it doesn't work, it doesn't achieve its stated aims, all of this sort of thing. So it was just, I went into a massive rabbit warren at that time, and that's how I got into it.
It was fascinating to me about all that, because I've read that a lot, that basically Neoreaction was radical libertarians who were dissatisfied with the ineffectualness of the libertarian movement. And yet you go from one sort of hyper abstract, non-pragmatic political programs such as radical libertarianism to an even more abstract and even more ineffectual or non-pragmatic movement or philosophical system such as Neoreaction. So because Neoreaction strikes me as even more intellectual, far more intellectual than even libertarianism, which is, most people agree, sounds great in theory, but isn't coming close to being enacted in actual practice. So what do you say to that? You've gone from one super abstract system to another.
Well, they're slightly different because, in a sense, Neoreaction doesn't necessarily want to do anything other than diagnose the problems. It doesn't necessarily offer
It's
solutions.
not really a political movement, is it? It's more of a philosophy. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it's a philosophy, and it's a way of describing problems. And one of the things about it is that, pardon me, the exact prescriptions for any situation will depend upon that particular situation. There's no one-size-fits-all model. And indeed, one of the aspects of Neoreaction is that there should be a kind of a patchwork of different systems, and people can choose the one that they like, or the one that suits their mode of living, if you like. And they can go there, and there will be a wide range of different styles of governance and so on and so forth. And so, all of those sort of compete against each other in a sense.
So they're really looking for a little bit more political pluralism than exists today. That one of the critiques of the whole end of history neoliberal vision is that it's a stultifying empire of monolithic ideas, that there is no pluralism, and that some people on the right want to see a more pluralistic approach to political life. So some things fit one kind of people, and other political arrangements are better for others. So is that what you're saying?
Yeah, all of these things will depend upon existing factors, a whole lot of different factors, the history of the people involved, the ethnicity of the people involved, all sorts of things. But the point is that there should be multiple options, and therefore people can sort of choose the one that they want. And ultimately there will be some that will be more successful than others. But this is preferable to the situation that we have at the moment, that is sort of almost profoundly anti-civilizational in a way. One of the things about Neoreaction, and I think a lot of people in the alt-right also believe this, is that we're in decline, where our civilization is in gross decay, essentially. And this is all because of the way the governance actually works. One of the key concepts in Neoreaction is this concept of the cathedral.
Yes.
And which is basically a sort of there can be people in the media, academia, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, all these sort of non-democratic but also non-autocratic institutions, and these things sort of function almost for themselves. Nobody quite knows what they do. Nobody quite knows what their purpose is other than self-perpetuation, and it's distributed. It's not part of a sort of a conspiracy, but it's this distributed network of people all moving in a particular direction. They're not even necessarily conscious of the fact that they're doing it in concert, but it's not democratic, but at the same time it doesn't have the same oversight that a king might have over his dominion. So all of that is just going in the wrong direction, essentially. That's what neo-reactionaries believe.
That, of course, is one of the criticisms of populism, that government becomes self-perpetuating, and that there's a self-perpetuating, self-dealing elite that pretends that it acts in the public interest, but really it's acting in its own interest. It's there to make sure that their jobs continue, and that government grows bigger every year, and that budgets increase and so on, and that the people in government move back and forth between lobbyist positions and the media and so on, and it becomes kind of a unelected government that rules the world against the wishes of the people. So we'll get into that in a moment when I talk about populism. But I mean, that's one of the reasons populist movements seem to arise, is when there seems to be a disconnect between what the government elites and the media are insisting on and what the people actually want. Then there's populist uprisings and a kind of return to first principles. But whether that can be successful or not, we can discuss that. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you about the futurism aspect. I know that Mencius Moldbug, I can never pronounce his name, or
Mencius
Moldbug, and his writings. I know he was a futurist, and this interests me because I've been reading a lot about the early intellectual groundwork of fascism, because people have been calling everybody on the right fascist, so I thought I might as well read what they actually wrote. And of course, they wrote many different things that nothing to do with a lot of what the people in conservative circles actually say. But when you actually study the early fascists, there was a very much a tie-in with futurism, the cultural movement known as futurism. And the early fascists definitely saw themselves as critiquing democracy, and of liberal democracy in particular, but also they had the same idea that the West was in decay, and that their movement was the wave of the future. And so they were into the futuristic modernism and so on, the architecture and everything. And I find it kind of strange that neo-reaction also has that kind of futuristic bent. And is it just a return, or is it something about these ideas lend themselves to that way of thinking?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that, particularly in the aesthetics of neo-reaction. But at the same time, I mean, this is something that has caused kind of a break, I suppose, within neo-reaction, that some people were radical traditionalists, and trying to sort of square those two positions didn't always work. Yeah, I think the thing about the neo-reactionary movement is it recognizes that there are elements of the past that are certainly better than the present, but we can never return to the past as such. That sort of idea of you can't step into the same stream twice.
Sure.
And that's actually not the way to go, because it won't work, and it also won't be attractive to the right people. But there is an element of trying to straddle both the past and the future. Now, as to how successful that is, that's another matter, I guess.
Well, you know, it's sort of interesting, because one of the things that strike many people as intellectually incoherent is the emphasis on the libertarian aspect of neo-reaction and the traditionalist collectivist aspect. That if neo-reaction was basically a hyper libertarian, or at least hyper libertarianism was sort of the spur to some of it, that seems at odds with the traditionalism and the desire for a more collectivist or a more holistic a return to a more holistic vision of society. Because, I mean, one of the hallmarks of modernism and of the Reformation even is this sort of emphasis on the individual. And, you know, every individual is his own pope and decides doctrine for themselves. And so how do neo-reactionaries reconcile the hyper-individualism that is at the core of libertarianism with this desire for a more holistic social cohesion? Or do they even care about that?
Well, they do. Well, I mean, many of them couldn't reconcile it, and that's why eventually I think Neoreaction kind of fell apart or faded away. Not everyone could agree upon certain things because there were these three different strands pulling in different directions.
Sure.
The sort of post-libertarians, the generally religious traditionalists, and the ethno-nationalists, and they're often pulling in different directions. And that was one of the major issues in Neoreaction a few years ago. And as far as I can tell, it was never adequately resolved because there are contradictions there. But I think one of the things that was attempted, at least, was to acknowledge that some aspects of post-libertarianism or just libertarianism are not working. And the whole liberal tradition in general, this individualism actually can make it worse for individuals in many regards, particularly if they sort of become completely atomized, and therefore they're easy pickings for other people. I think that's one of the big problems about libertarianism, that it's like herding kittens. And
it's like what?
Herding kittens.
Oh, herding kittens.
You know, it's really hard to organize people and to get them to put their individual desires aside, at least even just in the short term, in order to achieve something together. So these things haven't always been successfully resolved, but I think there was an acknowledgement that there are aspects of the Enlightenment that were good, but there are other aspects that have sort of led us to where we are today. And one of the things that Moldbug talked about or wrote about was this idea of modern progressivism being a sort of a descendant of Calvinism and sort of radical Puritan Protestantism, in that there are just all these iterations of that, and the most recent iteration is progressivism. And this is a process that once it begins, it goes to its conclusion, because there's nothing that can stop it other than sort of complete collapse eventually. And so whilst many neo-reactionaries are in many ways in favor of some of the libertarian ideas, I think they began to see their shortcomings. And as I said, initially I started to notice these things, and then I just happened to find neo-reaction, and it was like, aha, that's why that's happening, or they explain that really well, that process. So yeah, it hasn't always been successfully resolved, but I think also, as I said earlier, it's more of a descriptive system rather than a prescriptive system as such.
It's a philosophical diagnosis more than a plan of action. Well, I think everyone can agree that modernity or our modern arrangements have created a more atomized society in which people feel disconnected and there's not a sense of social cohesion. And I think a lot of people yearn for a more traditional way of life, or which I personally find better expressed in distributism. You know, the whole notion of a decentralized, smaller village, smaller town life, or a more rural life where people are more connected. You know, the atomization of modern cities is what many people are objecting to. But there has also been political strands and technological strands, the social media and all that seem to have pulled people apart. And American society feels more divided anytime in my lifetime. People are very, very divided. And I don't know if that's true outside the United States. That's sort of an interesting question. I watch a lot of Aussie TV, strangely. And and Kiwi TV, and actually any non-American television. My kids, when they were little, we watched McCloud's Daughters and so on. And
Oh God.
yes, I know. But one of the things that kind of struck me is, I just from the television, which of course is not real, but is some of the social problems that seem to exist in the United States don't seem as present in other places, in the sense that there seems to be more of a social cohesion, a greater homogeneity of the populace, not in terms of race or something silly like that, but in terms of just the cultural cohesion seems stronger because they're smaller. I mean, Australia is only 18 million people. The United States, okay, 24. I'm out of date. 24 million people, whereas the United States is 300 million. Canada is 33 million. So it could be. I mean, one of our favorite Simpsons episodes is when the Simpsons go to Australia, and it's, hey, Mr. Prime Minister, and he's floating around. That kind of access to your leaders, or that egalitarian spirit that exists in Australia, is largely absent in the United States. So our leaders are becoming kings and senators and so on, and they act like it. Whereas that seems to be absent in Australia, and certainly New Zealand. Maybe 4 million people in New Zealand. So is it just a question of bigness? I mean, is Australia and New Zealand and smaller countries simply have a greater social cohesion because they're smaller?
I can't comment on New Zealand, but I would say Australia has very little social cohesion these days, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, so the problem spreads.
Yeah, I mean, I've really noticed that. I've been away for 10 years, a bit more than 10 years, but I've been back pretty much every year, and I've noticed over that decade that the social cohesion in Australia is just terrible now. And
what are the divisions, if I may ask?
Oh, everything. Old people, young people, men, women. The men women thing is a huge thing in Australia, actually. I'm not sure if you've heard of the movement called MGTOW, but it's massive in Australia, and a lot of the big MGTOW content producers are from Australia for pretty good reason. Ethnic divisions, class, so rich, poor, city, country, pretty much everything. The thing I notice about Australia is that it doesn't really have its own culture as such. There is this kind of stereotypical Australian culture, but it's not accurate, actually, because Australia is one of the most urbanized countries on the planet. Over 80% of people live in cities, and the yes. 5 biggest cities have half the population of the country. The 2 biggest have about a third of the population more than a third of the population. So that's like saying in America that Los Angeles and New York would have over 100 million people between them. That's the equivalent. So wow. Australia's really urbanized, and Australia's always been very dependent upon other countries for its culture. So first Britain and now the US. So everyone is obsessed with sort of American culture, American consumerism, all of this stuff. I've really noticed that just over the past decade. It was already getting there, but it's really gone that way over the past decade. And I think it's actually, in many ways, it's in a far worse situation than some other countries. It appears to be very successful at the moment, but I think that's all a bit of a facade.
The lucky country?
Yeah, but that term was actually originally used in a disparaging manner to
ironically
say, yeah it was saying that I can't remember the full quote. It's something like Australia is a lucky country with second-rate politicians or something like that. Australia has always just sort of had everything fall in its lap, but I don't think that's going to continue for that much longer. And I mean, look, I could do a very long critique of what's wrong with Australia, but nevertheless,
that'll take us off topic. But I was just going to. But okay, so someone who's lived as an expat. So do you see these same trends, say, in Taiwan or in Asia or in any other countries you've traveled to? I've traveled a lot myself, and I do seem to think that a lot of this is Anglosphere, at least, centric. Although I'm now hearing that much of these battles are breaking out in France and so on. The French are now trying to correct their language, to have inclusive language. They're actually trying to neutralize the French language, which is just horrific for the language purists like the French. So some of these trends, some of the progressivism trends are obviously present in non-Anglosphere countries. But what is your perception of that? How are things outside of the Anglosphere then?
Well, I think this is slowly spreading to most parts of the world, because the problem is this: with the modernity is very attractive because modernity does bring tangible benefits, so increased lifespan and that kind of thing, and technological advancements and all of this sort of stuff. So that's very attractive to people everywhere in the world. That's why the West went that way, and it's why everyone else is going that way as well, because there have been tangible benefits. But they get conflated with a lot of the sort of cultural, philosophical aspects of modernity as well. So it is slowly starting to seep into other parts of the world. And here in Taiwan, for instance, often people associate Western things with being very good simply because they're Western, because for a long time, the West was superior. But in terms of some of these social movements, I think they're extremely destructive. But people still latch onto them because they think, well, they're Western, so therefore they think, well, Western medicine or Western science or whatever. These other things, they're all part of the same package. So we need all of these things if we're going to be modern and advanced and all of this sort of stuff. So it is spreading elsewhere, but I think it's most advanced in the Anglosphere. Because, I mean, culturally and linguistically, that's the closest to where all this is coming from, out of the US, right? It's much easier for another English-speaking country and one that has a relatively similar culture to take these things before a completely different culture, a completely different language does so.
So you see the U.S. as the source of the contagion, where the disease is spreading is from us.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, other places too. but I mean, Moldbug said that progressivism is just sort of, how did he say it? That it's essentially New England Puritanism exported to the world. That it's a very particular aspect of American culture, because it's not everyone in America who is like that. I mean, people from the South would take all sorts of objections with being lumped in with those people, but nevertheless, it's like the New England Puritans. Well, first they conquered these people in their own country, and there was a big war, obviously, in the 19th century. Yes. They did that, and then ever since they've been slowly exporting this. Yeah, it's spreading everywhere, basically.
So let me ask you about, first of all, the current status of neoreaction, if it's totally quiescent, but how do you see the ideas of neoreaction impacting our current political divisions and current political fights, particularly with the rise of populism and the dissident right and so on? What do you see that neoreaction has contributed to that? I've read that, Bannon in America, in terms of the advisor to Trump, he was supposedly a big fan of neoreaction, read a lot of Moldbug's writings and so on. Has it influenced the rise of establishment conservatism in the U.S.? And so is it finally having an impact in that sense? And is that a good thing or a bad thing, or how do you see it?
Well, neoreaction sits pretty uneasily with populism. I think it has inspired certain things, but it wouldn't necessarily be particularly proud of the way those things have turned out, because neoreaction is not really big on direct political action, for instance. But a lot of the ideas a lot of the critiques of modernity have been adopted by other people, but their way of enacting those things is quite different to what neoreactionaries envisioned. So it has had an influence, but it's gone off on a quite different tangent.
Yes.
I think in many ways the sort of post-libertarian strand has lost or disappeared. Maybe it's very difficult to know with these things, because one of the things about neoreaction is it doesn't promote active political action. Instead, it talks about sort of doing things behind the scenes. So it's always hard to know, well, are there actually people doing things behind the scenes, or has it just died, essentially? Yes. And the other two strands of neoreaction, or of the initial neoreaction, traditionalism and the ethno-nationalism, those are going quite strongly. But
yes, obviously.
but they're different to the sort of post-libertarian, futuristic, capitalistic kind of strand of it. So it's really hard to tell, actually.
Well, to the degree that Neoreaction does advocate a certain withdrawal from the political scene, do you see, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Benedict option, which is a Catholic or a conservative initiative. Rod Dreher of the American Conservative and so on argues that civilization has essentially collapsed, at least in the Christian understanding of things, and that it is time for conservatives and traditionalist people of religious faith and so on, to withdraw from what is essentially a corrosive civilization, corrosive to the soul, corrosive to human flourishing, and to withdraw and create their own communities, and basically in small towns. It's sort of the distributist vision to some degree, and basically to leave social justice warriors to themselves. Now, a lot of people are critical of this position because they see it as utter surrender and defeatism. But do you see any relationship between that and Neoreaction?
No, absolutely. Yeah, there's a concept in Neoreaction called passivism, not pacifism with an F, but with a V, which is basically this idea of you get your own house in order and you become worthy, such that when this current system falls apart, and people will want leadership, then you're in a position to offer it to them and to become worthy and then assume power. So yeah, that's definitely a strand within Neoreaction, and I think that's probably more the direction that I would move in, rather than the sort of alt-right direct political action.
Yeah. Well, it's that assumed power thing that makes people very nervous about Neoreaction, because it does sound fascistic in some sense. That, in other words, it sounds like people are biding their time until a technocrat, a Peter Thiel. And I'm not saying he would be the person or anything. I'm just saying a very rich technocrat can take over through some sort of coup or something, and that makes us Democrats, or with a small d, or us old-fashioned conservatives cringe when we read that. I mean, that's why I was never ultimately could ever embrace Neoreaction, because it seems there is a fundamentally anti-democratic element in it.
Absolutely.
that I find very chilling personally. But is that so? But I've always wondered if I was misunderstanding, or if that's actually what they're saying.
Yeah, definitely. It is anti-democratic because it's elitist. It doesn't believe that everyone's equal, or that everyone should have the same say in things. But I mean, they would actually say that democracy itself is a product of modernity, and so true conservatives wouldn't be Democrats. And they would point to ancient Greece as an example of how that ended up. So, I mean, with these things, it depends on where you want to draw the cutoff date or the beginning, because all of these concepts that we take for granted in our political system are products of modernity that were not by any stretch of the imagination taken for granted even 100 years ago.
Well, let me get to the heart of it then, because I was thinking about this, and I'm trying to remember who said I think it was the 16th century, some philosopher said that democracies will always fail, or the democratic experiment will always fail, when the majority realizes it can just vote itself all the money and power. And so when the founders of the United States organized to try and come up with the Constitution, they realized that the most important thing is to protect the rights of the minority. And the way you protect the rights of the minority is to create a system of government in which the powers that are granted to the government are strictly limited and strictly enumerated. And now the criticism of what has happened and that has lasted for 250 years and has provided a fairly stable and prosperous society. And that's why most Americans are relatively proud of our constitutionalist system. But the criticism is that over the last 50 to 100 years, an activist, progressivist judiciary has gradually eroded or subtly attacked that constitutional framework by finding loopholes and ways to expand the powers of government far beyond what they are enumerated. They're actually enumerated in the Constitution. It says that these are the powers the government has and no others, and that all the other powers reside in either the states or the people. But through subterfuges such as substantive due process and other judicial sleights of hand, activist judges have been able to gradually chip away at that. And now we have an expansionist government who is basically taking over and are throwing the Constitution to the winds and basically doing whatever it wants. So it can find, for example, a right to abortion in the emanations and penumbras of the Bill of Rights, even though there's nothing in any written text that would support it. So that's sort of been the criticism. And populism, at least in my mind, populism is a popular revolution or a popular reaction to try and force the elites and judicial activists to go back to the first principles, to the original founding text of the U.S. Constitution that strictly limits the powers of government and returns power to the people. That is sort of how I see the current rebellion as a return to U.S. constitutionalist principles. And so what would Neoreaction to say to this little speech that I just gave you?
There's a lot I could say about that. Well, I mean, I don't think it's a process that's only been going on for 100 years. Certainly, Abraham Lincoln had a pretty good shot at overturning all of that, and you could even go back to the Whiskey Rebellion, which was
absolutely.
George Washington was the one who put that down. So that didn't last very long. And I mean, Neoreaction would say that the founding fathers were very much a product of modernity, and they were the liberals of their time, in a sense.
Certainly, yes, they were.
So, I mean, this is the tricky problem, right? That if you say, okay, well, it was, I don't know, FDR, then you can say, well, what about Woodrow Wilson? Or you go back before him and you say, what about Abraham Lincoln? What about the Whiskey Rebellion? What about the Glorious Revolution in the UK in, what was that, 1688? Yes. And once you start pulling on that thread, you just keep going back farther and farther, essentially.
Well, so it's a continuum, and so there's always this tension, and there's always this temptation. There's always the totalitarian temptation, as Jean-François Revel, the French philosopher, put it. The totalitarian temptation exists in the human soul. So it seems to me that from a pragmatic point of view, the issue is how do we limit or contain or anticipate? How do we anticipate the totalitarian temptation and try to mitigate its worst effects? And that is what constitutional government attempts to do.
Yeah, though you have to separate out the fact that there was constitutional government, but the other really important aspect was that there wasn't universal suffrage. For most of history, most people have not really had much of a say in politics. Mm-hmm. And so there is a process by which once you start that ball rolling, it expands, and it's always going to expand. So it's just a matter of acceleration. The problems didn't manifest themselves, although I would say the American Civil War was a pretty big problem, yes. And it manifested itself with hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Twice the deaths of World War II for the United States, in fact, actually.
Right. So I'd say that things weren't exactly rosy by the second half of or at the middle, really, of the 19th century. But a lot of these things were held in check by the fact that you didn't get everyone voting. And this is one of the critiques that I started to notice of libertarianism, is that these libertarian ideas and ideals, they're held by a very, very small percentage of the population. The average, yes. the sort of profile of the average libertarian is a particular kind of white male. He's very he tends to be high on mathematical reasoning, that kind of thing. Maybe slightly awkward socially, but it's a very particular. Yeah, that's right. Someone who's attracted to engineering or something like that. Very analytical. And it's
people who have their own businesses tend to be libertarians.
That too. And so it really appeals to a very small section of the population, and I think it could be argued that the writers of the US Constitution were those kinds of men in their society. And so when suffrage was restricted to those kinds of men, you were going to get a libertarian type society. But as franchise expanded, you're going to get people pulling in other directions, and that's why libertarianism now is just not popular, because 97% of the population those people have no interest in those ideas. If you restrict the political system to those other 3%, then you're going to get the expression of those ideas.
So it was giving women the right to vote where civilization went downhill. That's what.
That was one of the points.
Yes. My wife and daughters would have strenuously object to that.
Of course, everyone would, right? Yeah, of course. But that's the whole problem. Once you let the genie out of the bottle, it's almost impossible to get it back in without a major crisis where people are so desperate that they're willing to try anything. And so that's why I think this process, once it begins, it almost necessarily needs to run its course.
Okay, well, it's very late for you. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I do kind of want to see, hear what you have to say about how you see our future, or what's happening. I mean, no one knows, but we're in a very chaotic time in the United States, especially, and also in Europe. I mean, Europe is in the middle of a mini cultural civil war right now over immigration, pro and anti. There's strong forces opposed to the mass immigration that they're seeing. And there's also strong forces in favor of it. So Europe is also very, very divided. The United States is certainly divided. You tell me that even the lucky country of Australia is divided. How do you see the next few years specifically, or how do you think the neo-reactionaries among you, your friends or people you talk to, see the next few years?
Well,
or you have no clue, or what?
No. I mean, I think in the short term, things there's that line. I think it's from Adam Smith. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. So these countries, they still have a long way to fall yet, and so they can continue doing crazy things for quite some time yet. I mean, people have been predicting the collapse of the US dollar, or they've been predicting that there'll be some sort of debt implosion because all of these countries are running up massive amounts of debt and so on. And in the long term, yes, but there's also that line by, I think it was Keynes, who said the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And so these things can limp along for much longer than we would expect. In the long run, I don't think that they can. The only way that they could continue in the long run would be to have some sort of dystopian Big Brother Orwellian type society that could really keep everyone in check. Now, I don't think that would necessarily last indefinitely either. But other than that occurring, I think that one of several things will happen. Either these countries will become sort of like Brazil, these barely functional but highly dysfunctional countries, or everything will come to a head. And I think that my prediction for all of this is that there'll be different situations in different countries. I think Europe is probably going to collapse into, or at least Western Europe is going to collapse into civil war, quite nasty civil war within the next couple of decades. Now, that might sort itself out. I don't know who would win that. It's a bit touch and go, but that could one way or another. I think that problem will be resolved in Europe. It will be resolved, and that might still mean sort of the twilight of European civilization, because
a lot of people think there's the technocrats, the big tech is partnering with the neoliberal elitists to try and basically squelch populism, or squelch the popular, through speech control. There's going to be a new censorship,
right?
A massive censorship. And so any idea that's not cleared by what the neo-reactionaries would call as the cathedral will be just simply eliminated and won't even be heard, because Google and YouTube and Twitter and all these social media things will just not tolerate it.
Well, that's what I mean by it would have to be completely Orwellian. Now, yes. I don't think that's likely to happen, because I think the reality on the ground is just too stark in much of Western Europe now, and people realize that the emperor has no clothes, and I don't think they're going to be able to just bamboozle people like this. I think it's just going to come to a head far too quickly because of the people involved. The foreigners within Europe are pushing the envelope far too hard, far too quickly, and I don't think that this is just going to be smoothed over. So I think there'll be a pretty hard resolution one way or the other in Europe.
The clash of civilizations.
Yes, and that will be resolved one way or the other. Now, the US, I think, I suspect that, again, unless it goes completely Orwellian, the US could become a kind of northern Brazil. That's one possible outcome. The other is the breakup of the US. And again, that could be quite messy and violent, but that's probably, I would say that's probably the only positive outcome for the US, because otherwise it just becomes the northern Brazil.
What do you mean by the northern? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's going to resemble Latin America ethnically and socially and politically. It'll be barely functional, but also highly dysfunctional at the same time. I mean, look at Brazil, right? Look at most of Latin America. They lurch from one crisis to the next, and they do function, but not really well. So, it's just, if you start bringing a lot of Latin Americans into America, then America is going to look like Latin America, and politics and culture will be downstream from that. I think that the only way out of that really is if the US breaks up. But of course, the last time people tried to secede, that was pretty violent, pretty bloody. But I think it might be possible for the US to resolve this. But I think the US, as it currently exists, is not going to exist by the end of my lifetime.
Wow.
And then I would say the other countries in the Anglosphere, so Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they have great similarities, and I think they have a different issue, which is that they're essentially importing a new managerial class, a new upper middle class, professional class, because they have highly functional immigration. So the problems in those countries are not as obvious, because you don't have people blowing people up every other week, like in Europe, for instance. Mm-hmm. But essentially, these places they're going to have a weird kind of set of social divisions, but they'll be fairly functional. But they might end up being barely recognizable as the West eventually.
Let me end by asking you this. I mean, it seems to me, and the reason I don't actually embrace a lot of this stuff is that the doom and gloom vision seems to be the province of the left, of the hard left. And I'm old enough that I have heard predictions of the collapse of civilization my entire life. And I remember in the late 1970s, when all the conservatives were writing books about the coming Great Depression, the economic collapse. One was written like in 1979, they wrote the coming breakup of the United States, the economic collapse, right before Reagan was elected, and it was the greatest peacetime expansion of the U.S. economy in history, or the greatest expansion of the U.S. economy.
For some people, though, I mean, if you're living in the Rust Belt, you're already living collapse.
That's true. But anyway, my point is that the decline of the West when was the decline of the West written? In 1910, maybe eventually, maybe they're predicting over centuries, and we just haven't gotten there yet. But I have heard predictions of doom my entire life. Climate change. The New York Times has been predicting that climate change would destroy the world since 1900. When I was a kid in the 60s, Paul Ehrlich was predicting the population bomb would come and we would all starve to death in the next 10 years. I've heard predictions we're going to run out of oil in 5 or 10 years. None of this has happened ever. And so I tend to think of predictions of doom to be the province of the left, to try and get us to do stuff we don't want to do. So let me throw that right back at the right. Isn't this just a fear mongering to try and get us to do stuff that we might not be inclined to do otherwise? And isn't this just rhetoric? And really, the evidence of decline is overstated. That's my final parting question to you. So,
in some cases, yes, but I think as I said, if you're living in the Rust Belt, you're already living the collapse. If you're living in an ex-industrial town in the northern UK, you're already living the collapse.
Yes.
If you're a young person now who's graduating with massive amounts of debt and can only get a job at Starbucks, you're living the collapse right now.
Yes, that's fair.
So I think the demographics have changed radically. There's been a massive loss of religiosity. By the sort of traditional conservative metrics, society is doing far worse than it was even just a few decades ago.
Well, it depends on the metrics. I mean, crime seems to be way down. Violence, deaths through war, for example, are way, way down. So economically, I think you might be right, but some metrics are doing better.
Yeah, some are sure. But I think
I mean, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in history in terms of death through war and death through government, and that seems to have fallen dramatically. Now, if you're right, we may see it may be a temporary respite. Yes,
Europe had a pretty long peace, broadly speaking, between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World Wars, essentially a century. I mean, they had very minor conflicts over those intervening 100 years. So I think it's a mistake for us to think that we've kind of solved all of this, because I actually think that I think a lot of these 20th century issues have not been resolved. I think the 20th century was a century full of ridiculous utopianism, and it was one form of utopianism that won out over others. So first fascism was defeated, and then eventually communism was defeated. But liberalism is another form of this, and I think that this has not been resolved adequately, and it's pushing up against all sorts of people and groups who don't like it. And I think it's going to come to a head. I think this century could be quite bloody, actually. I mean, I'm not putting any timelines on any of these things, but nothing lasts forever. And there does seem to be a kind of exhaustion, social, spiritual, and all of the rest of it. Plus, the demographics are just radically different. The World War I was essentially a war between Europeans, and the coming wars are not going to be a sort of a civilizational civil war in that regard.
Well, I'd like to thank you. You know, the thing that, again, if I'm providing a guide for normies, what amazes me about YouTube and some of the political channels you find on YouTube is that these ideas, while some of them are very radical, are actually being discussed. And they provide a lens into our situation. I just think you just don't get on the corporate media. I mean, as I said, once you spend some time listening or talking to some of the people on YouTube, the sort of the talking head, blow dried BBC newsreader type things, just But
I mean, that's by design, right? Obviously, the everything that you see in the mainstream media is not accidental by any stretch of the imagination. So.
Well, that takes us to a level of conspiracy that is beyond. I think it's primarily driven by this search for money myself, but
well, that's
whatever I think will work in terms of ad dollars is what drives the media, as far as I can tell. But anyway, what I'm saying is I'm just amazed that people like yourself take the trouble to research these things. I mean, this is a very difficult intellectual pursuit, and to share these ideas through YouTube, and to stay up late until midnight in a foreign country talking to somebody like me, to me is hopeful and sign of that the world is not totally asleep and people are willing to discuss all this stuff. That gives me a little hope. I don't know if it gives you any hope, but it gives me a little hope.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've actually met people in real life.
Actually in real life.
Yeah. I've met probably about 8 people, 9 people, something like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Is there like a Neoreaction club? I mean, do people get together?
I mean, these days I sort of straddle both Neoreaction and the alt-right. So I've met people through my channel. People have contacted me. I've met some here in Taiwan. I've met some in Australia when I've been back there. There are lots and lots of people, young people particularly, who are just fed up with the way things are going. And they're searching for credible answers. I mean, that's why I got into all of this and why I started doing this as well, because it was as much about my own questions and trying to find some sort of peace of mind. And I've learned a lot along the way, as it was doing it for others. I mean, I think that's why a lot of people are involved in this, because as I said right at the beginning, I was a libertarian for well over a decade, and eventually I realized that there were just certain things that didn't sit well with me about that, and I went from there, I suppose.
Well, thank you very much. I don't want to take any more of your time. It's late, but I hope to be in touch with you again. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. There's nothing like it in my little town, my little beach town that's even close to discuss ideas like this. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure. You should contact the distributist. I believe I mentioned him in.
I've already talked to him. I've talked to the distributist. I'm basically I'm a Catholic, conservative Catholic, and I would call myself a distributist, except I think distributism is even more abstract and than neo-reaction, in the sense that it has no touch with reality at all, and in terms of any practical political agenda. But its ideals, I think, are legitimate and appeal to me. I'm sort of an agrarian and ruralist and localist and all that stuff.
Yeah, I like all of that too. And I think it can actually be applied. Not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily get everybody on board, but I think that there's actually some hope for that. And that's a direction that I'm more interested in going, because I'm going to return to Australia this year.
Well, people don't want to live. I have many children. Nobody wants to live in small towns or a rural situation. That for the young, the cities are where it's at. That's where the jobs are. That's where they want to live. That's where the excitement is. And when, as you get older, I'm now 60. God, that doesn't appeal to you as much.
Yeah, I think that's changing though, because I think a lot of young people are starting to realize that the cities are not working for them. They can't get good jobs there.
Yes, that's true.
They can't start families there. They can't own anything there, and they find them alienating places. Not everyone, but there are quite a few young people I know through my channel who find big cities to be completely alienating now. I think there will be at least a minor kind of back to the land movement.
To the land movement, yes. Well, that seems to be cyclical. I mean, that in the history of distributism, that was actually started out as that, as the Father Vincent McNabb and the back to the land movement in the early 20th century in England, and the arts and crafts movement in England. So these things do come in waves. People become alienated from the cities and want to get back to a more holistic lifestyle. But right now, I don't see that happening too much in the U.S. in the sense that a lot of people want to move to the big cities and get big fancy jobs and so on.
I mean, you have to sort of discover these things, but I have found there are a lot of YouTube channels that involve young people from the city moving to the country and starting homesteads and things like that. Oh, well, I mean, that's the thing. Unless you stumble across these things, you don't know about them. But I think there is a bit of that going on, actually.
How old are you, if I may ask?
41, almost 42.
41,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just about to turn 42.
Okay. Well, any last parting recommendations of channels or other for people who want to follow up? Or places they should go to learn more about Neo? I know you could just Google Neoreaction, you'll find a ton of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, these days Neoreaction doesn't seem to be really alive anymore. There's still some of it around. I don't really follow it very much these days. I'm somewhat in the alt-right, but even then I'm sort of doing my own thing.
You don't sound scary. I mean, in terms of the alt-right is these scary Nazis or whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what the corporate media would like to have you believe. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. In terms of Neoreaction, well, the main site that still does Neoreaction is called Social Matter.
Oh yes,
so that's the one to look at, I suppose, or look at the archives of Mencius Moldbug's writings. You can find those online. But yeah, everything seems to have sort of disappeared. There's another guy, Nick Land, who's a British philosopher who now lives in China, and he had a pretty active blog for a few years, but over the past year or so, he hasn't really done very much.
Yes. They're all exhausted from all that thinking.
Yeah, well, I think they're just sort of getting on with their lives, and some of them actively dropped out. There was a guy called Henry Dampier, and he was pretty good, but he actively dropped out.
Disavowed.
Well, no, he didn't disavow, but I think a lot of these guys, they didn't want to be in the public limelight anymore, and they're doing stuff behind the scenes.
Sure.
So that's one of the really difficult things about Neoreaction. It can be really cliquish. So yeah, I mean, the focus seems to have gone towards the alt-right, but the neo-reactionaries think that's a doomed idea, trying to do political activism. I don't know.
And the alt-right would be more populist, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And so the neo-reactionaries are not so keen on that. I mean, I have I'm sort of somewhere in between the two, and not necessarily successful at doing that. Yeah, I don't know. Just look around for this stuff online, I guess.
Well, thank you, Mr. Expat.
Thanks. Yeah,
and
thanks for having me.
hopefully we can chat again.
Sure.
I've had a great time. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye.